We're gonna go ahead and get started. So Sarah's getting us pulled up. We'll have an online audience as well. All can divert it. So my name is Brett Blum. I am the director of the Southern Arizona Experiment Station Network for the University of Arizona. Also serving now as the interim director for the Arizona Experiment Station Network. So if you have tried to get in touch with me lately and haven't been able to, it's probably because I'm somewhere around the state. I say all of that only because if it feels a little chilly in here, it's because the heat went down and I wasn't here, and so I apologize for the lack of climate control conditions. So this is the first in our series of 4, what we call Discovery Fridays seminar series through the Santa Rita Experimental Range. This year in particular, we're very, very excited. I'm going to give Sarah Nelly here full credit for coming up with the idea of developing a working consortium with additional research stations across the desert Southwest. And so we'll be working with our partners. We'll get into this a little bit more here, not for some of the credit, but ultimately the way that this will work is I'll talk today about Santa Rita Experimental Range. Many of you who have been here in the past, some elements of this talk will seem very familiar, but then we're also going to incorporate a talk from both the Jornada Research Station in New Mexico and the collaborations with both the USDA, New Mexico State University, and others, as well as Texas A&M Sonora Research Station. So we're looking at this as a jumping off point for how do we pair these long-term longitudinal data sets in the semi-arid systems we've all been working for over a century now. What do those data sets mean, both for the past, where we've been in, where we are today, and ultimately where we're going in the future. So it'll be really exciting. And that is then the segue. I'm going to move to this side for our kickoff for the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists. Has anybody heard about this initiative? A couple of you, that's great. So this is a UN-led initiative. It's been driven in large part by folks from the University of Arizona, namely Barb Hutchinson, Flavia Guan, and others. Everything all right?
Yeah, they're just seeing presenter mode.
Got it. I'll talk a little bit more about IYRP while we're getting this pulled up. So anyways, the idea is that this is a global initiative. It took over 90 countries to sign off that, yes, this is a good thing. We want to move it forward. Mongolia was one of the primary sponsoring countries for this initiative. Years in the makings to actually launch, and 2026 is it. And the idea is, how do we bring attention and better understanding and ultimately appreciation for rangelands across the globe? So not just here in the desert Southwest. What does this mean for Argentina? What does this mean for Namibia, for Mongolia, Canada, Hawaii, any place where there's a rangeland? Because the majority of terrestrial biomass on the planet is comprised of these semi-arid systems. And so very, very important, most of our cropland, significant amounts of biomass, think mass migrations of large wildlife, bison, wildebeest, things of that nature, elephants, all persist on these rangelands because they're hyper-productive, but comparatively understudied compared to other systems like forests, rainforests, things of that nature. So the pastoralist piece then is more a focus on who's interacting with these. What is the legacy of these rangeland systems? So who are the pastoralists that are running livestock in the desert Southwest? Again, what does that mean for different tribal approaches to rangeland management in sub-Saharan Africa or Mongolia? So how do we blend those pieces together and bring global recognition? So all these pieces fit very well together. This is the schedule here, and we'll follow up because I know it's not legible for those of you in the audience. As far as last Friday of every month, starting with the University of Arizona Santa Rita Experimental Range, Jornada Research Station, Texas A&M Sonora Station, and then finally our kickoff for the IYRP International Year of Rangeland and Pastoralist panel discussion about how these pieces fit together, what it means for rangelands globally. So before we get into this, I do want to thank a bunch of folks. I like to put the acknowledgements at the beginning rather than the end. Many of you who have been here before and historically interacted and overlapped with Mark Heitlinger, the former manager at the Santa Rita Experimental Range. Mark is and has been very dedicated for 15 years, basically the lifeblood of the Santa Rita, and also a historian. So a lot of the historical elements that we'll cover today were developed by Mark. This is a continuation of the work done by himself. Doctors Mitch McLaren and Alessandro Gorlier from the research management perspective. So Dr. Mitch McLaren is the research director for the Rita Experimental Range. Dr. George Rule is the former, now retired, emeritus status Marlene Dowd Chair for Sustainable Rangeland Stewardship. So we'll talk about virtual fencing, grazing rotation patterns, livestock interactions on the Santa Rita and elsewhere. George is instrumental in that. Sarah, as I mentioned here, was the one who said we should bring all these people together. Sarah is about the most skilled range person I have met, most connected. And again, similar to Mark and everybody else here, none of the pieces on the range would function without Sarah, both on Santa Rita and elsewhere. I also would like to welcome Dr. Amy Ganguly, who has come in as the new Marlene Dowd Chair for Sustainable Rangeland Stewardship at the University of Arizona. So really bright, promising future for how do we tie these pieces together with this research network and so many others here. And then again, as we go through the seminar series, what does this mean for our partners and collaborators across the desert Southwest? So diving into the history piece, going back now, think late 1800s, 1860s, 70s, and 80s, livestock was one of the primary drivers in the desert Southwest, Western United States, generally, primary economic driver, and in Arizona in particular, one of the 5 C's, so cattle, cotton, climate, citrus, and copper. Cattle was king in this, but at that time, there was not really a notion of sustainability, right? What is the stocking rate? How do livestock interface with the environment? Really, the idea is, well, the more cattle we put on the environment, the more we can extract, the more profit we make. That's it. Not really anybody's fault. There just wasn't that understanding, that connection there. So what happened then is in the early 1890s, about 1890, 91, there was a catastrophic drought in the desert Southwest. In southeastern Arizona alone, livestock population decreased by over 50% die-off rate. At that time as well, in Arizona territory, livestock outnumbered people by a factor of 10 to 1. And there was not much in the way of fencing, not much again in the way of any sort of management. It was just an extractive system because that was the way people knew how to do business. This was the byproduct. At the same time, a young professor named Robert Forbes moved to Tucson as a chemist and a botanist to head what was then the Arizona Agriculture Experiment Station, now today the Arizona Experiment Station Network, part of the University of Arizona's land grant and the land grant mission, which is to be an economic driver for fields in agriculture, military readiness, natural resources, and others. Also to ensure that the work we do at the University of Arizona is accessible to the community. So if we do research, right, and it ends up in a peer-reviewed paper or sits on a shelf, what's the value of that research? We need to be able to translate that research and have it branch into division that not only enables and facilitates those kinds of research, but also then translates that direct to public benefit, industry partnerships, things of that nature. So Forbes came in to head this network. Santa Rita is a part of that network. Next slide. He looked around and saw instances like this. This is the Vail stockyards in the 1890s following some of these die-off events, and said, in a balanced ecosystem, we don't see these big cycles of boom and busts. You know, there's snowshoe hares and lynx and things where there's some outliers, but by and large, in a balanced system, everything stays pretty close to the mean. There might be fluctuations depending upon environmental variables, but you don't get these major die-offs. So what are the drivers of that? And ultimately, what's our influence? What do we need to understand? So some of the other pieces he noticed, this is from New Mexico, not Arizona, but things like head cutting, channeling, erosion, degradation of soil, soil loss, things of that nature as well that weren't otherwise inherent in the systems. So Forbes had an observation. There was a book that came out around the same time, some of you may be familiar with, called Tragedy of the Commons. And his observation was the ruinous methods which seem inevitable upon a public range, which, being everybody's property, is nobody's care. So what that means is that if you don't have ownership, if you don't have a stake in the management of those landscapes, then you're free to just extract, focus on maximum extraction without ever having to give back, right? So somebody will move their livestock herd through, they'll graze to whatever point that they're going to move their herd on. The landscape might regenerate, it might not. Somebody else moves that herd through, they take what they can get and move on, and the cycle continues. There's no ownership, there's no consequence, there's none of that. So again, focusing on that idea of the tragedy of the commons. So how do we take a system from that level and move it in where there is a public buy-in, there's accountability, but there's also real support that we can provide to the systems. So based off of that, Forbes hatched an idea that we need a rangeland system, a rangeland study system. And 1901, he hears that Gifford Pinchot, who many of you may be familiar with, I would say the founder of the U.S. Forest Service, if we want to put it that way, really at the forefront of the modern environment movement with John Muir or other folks at the turn of the century. He hears that Gifford Pinchot is going to be at the American Forestry Association meeting in Denver, Colorado. So Forbes hatches this idea that just like I'm doing today, I'm going to give a presentation knowing that Pinchot is going to be in the audience, and I'm going to tailor that presentation to him on the need for a large-scale rangeland reserve to examine ecological interactions of livestock grazing. So he does that. The two hit it off. To Forbes' plan. Pinchot thinks it's a great idea, takes it back to Washington, D.C., originally went to William McKinley. Unfortunately, McKinley was assassinated, and it very quickly lands on the desk of Theodore Roosevelt. So don't have to tell any of you about the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt, probably the most conservation-minded president in American history. Very early in the Roosevelt presidency, he signs proclamations 467 and 468, which were the very first land designation ceremonies of his presidency. So think all the national forests, national monuments, national parks of Roosevelt's legacy of conservation. San Isabel Forest Reserve has the distinction of being the very first one because it was 467, but Santa Rita Forest Reserve, now the experimental range today, was Proclamation 468, establishing the first and what is now the oldest continually operating experimental rangeland in North America, as far as we are aware, globally. And Roosevelt knew what he was doing. He knew that this was a rangeland reserve. He knew the details, but Roosevelt also knew that no one in Washington was going to come out to verify that this was in fact a range reserve rather than forest reserve. So it was established as a forestry reserve. Quote by J.J. Thornburg from the Times says, it, being the Santa Rita Experimental Range, its purpose was expressly understood to be the study of grazing range problems with a view, if possible, to a demonstration on a large and convincing plan of range restoration and control. So where does U of A fit into this? So Robert Forbes, right? Now, anyone who's been to the Forbes building on main campus, named for Robert Forbes, anyone who's been to main campus at all, seen the olive trees that line a lot of the walkways. Main campus was an Arizona experiment station when it got started as part of the land grant institution, Hatch Act in the late 1800s. So that's part of his legacy with all of this. But ultimately, Santa Rita Experimental Range was federally managed by the U.S. Forest Service until 1988. So the University of Arizona has always been a collaborator and a key partner in the management of the Santa Rita, but it wasn't until '88 where U of A formally took over management of the experiment station. The reason for the shift was that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wanted to establish the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge in the south end of the Altar Valley, about 40 miles to our southwest. They needed to make a transaction with the state to give back a proportionate amount of federal land to swap for additional federal land for the Buenos Aires. Santa Rita transferred from Forest Service to Arizona Board of Regents and then to Arizona State Land Department and U of A to be managed in perpetuity for research and conservation purposes. So where are we talking about? For those of you in this room, presumably you know exactly what we're about. For those of you that are online, we'll give you a bit more of a perspective. We're sitting right here, located just south of Tucson by about 25 miles. I have this broader perspective as well, so you can see where we are in relation to other partners. We're not a research station here in South Central New Mexico, and then Sonora Station here in Southwest Texas. So again, adjacent to Tucson, just zooming in a little bit, and then keep going. So to give you some perspective, about 52,000 acres or 21,000 hectares. This is an overlay of the boundary of Santa Rita over Tucson, so encompassing most of the greater Tucson metro area. or about 2.5 times the size of Manhattan Island. So I can attest to the difficulty of trying to manage a rangeland that is both productive for research, productive for rangeland conditions, while also balancing people, climate, all of the things that we're all very familiar with. And again, primarily composed of Arizona State Trust land, some private inholdings here, and then where we are at the Florida Station being on Forest Service. And so Florida Station for our headquarters is technically a long-term historic lease to the U.S. Forest Service. It is the longest continuing partnership between a university and the U.S. Forest Service, dating back again before the Forest Service was even the Forest Service. So 1902, I think Forest Service was 1904, 1906 perhaps, maybe somebody knows. But anyways, longest continual running partnership between a federal agency being Forest Service and a university. So Santa Rita is comprised of 3 primary ecotypes. The lower elevations here on the west, about 950 meters or 3,100 feet, closest to the Santa Cruz being a Sonoran desert, closer to a true Sonoran desert or what we would call a Sonoran upland. So comprised of creosotes, prickly pears, a lot of mesquite still, saguaro cacti, things of that nature, lower density in terms of the grass. So you can see more of the shrubbery with some of the burrow weeds and things. So not quite as dense as some of those perennial grasses. Really the bulk of the range here in these midsections, about 975 meters to 1,200 meters or up to 4,000 feet, being comprised of what we would call a mesquite savanna. And this is important, and we'll get into the details of that savanna type because it wasn't always this way. But as you can see in this picture here, much higher density of much increased biomass, we'll put it that way, especially with these perennial grasses. And then in the upper ends here, over 4,000 feet, we get into more of these woody woodlands. So going to the past, once the range was formally established in 1902, there's a long period of rest. So the range in the Santa Rita Experimental Range, specifically but generally throughout southeastern Arizona, was so denuded following that drought. And I do want to put this out there as well for perspective in terms of where we were versus where we are today. The drought in 1891, 92, 93 at the time was catastrophic. Now we just call it a drought. That's like every 5 years. So this was a major monumental shift over 100 years ago. Now it's kind of just become a cost of doing business. We build it in that we expect that to almost be the mean. We dance around either side, but those conditions are a little more static, and that would be one of the drivers we talked about going forward. So anyways, significantly degraded and denuded rangelands as a result of overgrazing paired with an inability to regenerate. So there's not enough rain to for multiple years to help regenerate the grasses that do remain, again, resulting in topsoil loss, erosion, things of that nature. So primary driver on the Santa Rita in the beginning was just, how is this place going to recover? What does that mean before we introduce grazing? And so a lot of work was done just to look at the botany, some phenology work, and just what are the mechanisms that actually drive this rangelands towards recovery. After about 12 to 15 years, grazing was reintroduced. So here we see 20 years after the establishment of the range, actively branding cattle. So this would be Box Canyon here for those that are familiar, looking towards what would be the northeast here from the range. So this picture is taken just about 1.5 miles from our headquarters here. So grazing is reintroduced on the range, and this then enables research outcomes related specifically to ecological interactions with livestock. Another critical piece in this, though, is we still wanted to examine how these systems are able to regenerate themselves. So at the same time that grazing is reintroduced, a network of grazing exclosures were established. Over 100 grazing exclosures, different dimensions, sizes, and areas across the Santa Rita. So we now have the ability to go back in these different areas and look at regions that have been grazed continuously by livestock for over a century, as well as those that have been untouched by livestock grazing for over 120 years for comparative analysis. So I think these deep time perspectives. I threw this one in as well, just because it harkens back to my own master's research. So for those of you that can see, this is the gentleman sitting in the front of his Forest Service truck, staring at a cow with a pair of binoculars. And that is science. So I appreciate it just because it seems so simplistic, but ultimately what he is doing a bite analysis, looking at how much of that biomass is being consumed by this cow as it eats. So really a fairly granular perspective in terms of how, how are these cattle interacting with their environment. The reason I bring up my master's work is I had done the same with bighorn sheep, basically looking at bighorn sheep observations hour after hour after hour, being able to translate what is sort of a loose aggregation of behaviors into numbers and actually turning that into data. So you can actually glean a lot just from staring at critters with binoculars.
What are the grasses? Are they the native here?
This in 1937, it's probably a combination of both.
Really?
Yeah, and so do you remember when layman's was introduced? It was about this
I think it
time.
was, yeah,
Before the proliferation of
Yeah.
them. So as far as the specific species, Mitch, if you're listening, anybody else, maybe you can drop it in the chat. I'm not aware of this particular species.
That's not lame.
But so layman's was introduced around this time, I believe in the 30s, but there wasn't really that mass proliferation until a few decades later. So blending all these different pieces again, rest, recovery, how do these range systems actually recover following these periods of intensive grazing? What are the different dynamics, things of that nature? That really defines the first couple of decades on the Santa Rita. So at this time, very early on, 1904, a guy named David Griffiths was hired as the very first full-time researcher on the Santa Rita Experimental Range. And his job, according to the federal government, Teddy Roosevelt said, we give you your rangeland facility, now you have to produce. We need products, there needs to be a value behind this. So your job is to go out and tell us what a fixed stocking rate is on a fixed amount of acres. That was it. Anybody sitting in this room now is like, well, I don't know if it's that simple. But I think it's really reflective of the mindset at the time that we just didn't know. That wasn't the prevailing thought process at the time. So Griffith sets out to do exactly that and very quickly realized that at this time, now I can't tell you a fixed stocking rate, in his words, a region where the seasons, the altitude, the slope, and the rainfall are so variable. So what Griffiths did inadvertently is identify the field of ecology and said, I can't tell you a fixed stocking rate on the north end of the range versus the south end, let alone winter versus summer versus bad years, wet years, dry years, things of that nature. But what we can do is figure out what those variables are that are at play, how we quantify them, and ultimately what they mean. So you can then apply these same principles from the Santa Rita to the Jornada to Sonora Station. Again, Argentina, Mongolia, it doesn't matter. How do we develop the methodologies and the understanding of these dynamics and be able to quantify them the world over? So not the first one, well, among the first doing this again as a network, but a lot of the advances in rangeland ecology were being made at this time by Griffiths and others. So as a representation of what this looks like, Griffiths is talking about these sorts of differences. For perspective, we're sitting here on the right. This is Madera Canyon, so we're looking to the south from Santa Rita. You can see this big alluvial fan coming from Madera Canyon. This is all of the, this is essentially the substrate that used to be the Santa Rita Mountains, Madera Canyon. So different soil type here than what we have in the bulk of the range is a sandier soil type. So this is more of a clay loam versus a sandy loam being partitioned by Florida wash right here in the middle. So what is essentially maybe 100 to 300 meter span, we get a fundamentally different ecotype based off of that soil, differences in that soil. So more dense soil prohibits generation of mesquite. Sandier soil type encourages proliferation of mesquite, and so those things shift. So that's just a very simple indication of some of the ecodynamics that Griffiths and others are trying to account for. As well as, again, larger differences in space, higher elevations towards these oak woodlands, lower elevations in the true creosote and what we call true Sonora Desert area, as well as time. Again, what does this mean winter versus summer or spring in this case? And then how do we take into account changes in climate patterns and weather? So as part of our repeat photography, and we'll get into this more in a little bit, here is a vision of the Santa Rita in spring, taken from, I believe, probably pasture one or somewhere nearby. In April of the year 2000, here it is again in 2007, and you can see very clearly that there's a distinct absence of biomass 7 years later in this picture. Another way to put this graphically is accounting for precipitation and some of these extreme shifts. So what we have here is represented the driest year on record on the Rita Experimental Range. Mean summer precipitation, May to September in the year 2020. Anybody who is here on the Santa Rita or Green Valley area, and I'm assuming as well New Mexico and Texas, registered as an incredibly dry year. Followed by what was the wettest year on record, 2021. So rather than again having that bouncing around close to the mean, now we're getting these extreme climate shifts. What does that mean for these ecosystems and the way that we interact with them? And then we can see here are both the extremes compared to our long-term mean average for precipitation across our stations. So that's how it looks graphically. The way that that looks visually is June 2021, coming off the driest year on record. Here's pasture 3, and it does not look good. Even the prickly pears look very, very bad. So June 2023, and then August, on the next slide, looks like this. Same pasture. So these desert systems, these semi-arid systems are very well equipped to respond to minimal precipitation, right? That is what they do. That's how these semi-arid systems and arid systems work. But they can't do that if we have these big swings. So in this case, yes, hyperproductive, a lot of rainfall is a very good thing, but the farther we get from that consistency, the more inconsistent it gets, the harder it is for these systems to bounce back, and the harder it is for the species that depend on this sort of generation to know about timing. When do I need to show up? So phenological principles. When is this flower going to be in bloom? What do we do for our grazing rotation plan? Because it was supposed to rain and it didn't. So now we have to adjust our stocking rate, things of that nature. So trying to just account for as much of that variation as we can in these systems. So the byproduct of that was a network of a long-term experimental network on the Santa Rita. And so all of these dots here indicate different elements of long-term research distributed across the Santa Rita that are now maintained by Dr. McLaren and Dr. Gorlier. So we have orange dots here representing the long-term photosites, repeat transect locations represented by the blue, long-term study areas, and a lot of these exposures that I talked about. And then all the black lines are the rows under. So this is continuously maintained data. I don't have the precipitation sites on there as well, but we've also maintained continuous logs of precipitation data or 21 sites across the range for over a century. We'll get into what this means in a little bit. So going in a bit of a deeper dive here on repeat photography. Santa Rita houses the world's largest repeat photo series. So we can look now at dozens of photo stations across the Santa Rita at a change over time. And so this is one of the more stark and I think really compelling series here. So this photo is taken by David Griffiths here in his carriage at Werfeno Butte, an iconic feature on the north center end of the range in what by all accounts is a reasonably healthy desert grassland. Most of these species here are hackberries. There's some limited mesquites in the wash, but overall very open. Fast forward to 2019, pardon me. Fast forward to 2019, same photo, same location, looks very, very, right? And so this gets back to, well, what is it that David Griffiths is trying to account for? And what is it that every researcher who's come after him is trying to get at? Which is the drivers and the mechanisms behind these changes. Is it good? Is it bad? We don't really know. We have to understand what those drivers are and then ultimately understand what our role is within the systems. So here's the same breakdown. You can see this change over time. So again, beginning in 1902, 1951, proliferation of that mesquite, more of the same, not substantially different, at least visually, and we'll get into some of the non-visual elements in a minute. Over 20 years between 51 and 71, but then up here to 2023, fundamentally different system and ecotype than where we started more than a century before. So that is one of the key components of the Santa Rita. I would also say the Jornada and Sonora Station is trying to leverage these long-term data sets to be able to understand again what those changes mean, what those drivers are, and ultimately what that means for the future. So put another way, actually let me back up. One of the key pieces in here that you can see from those photos from Werfno is that there's a fundamental shift. And I mentioned this earlier, right? Think about that mesquite savanna type because it wasn't always this way. Fundamental shifts. Here we see a photo from the top of Werfno Butte, that little mountain in the last photo series. This is a photo looking to the northeast on the range. You can see that there's mesquite, there's hackberry, but they're mostly relegated to the washes and otherwise really desert grassland. Same photo in 2007 and fairly saturated in woody species, woody encroachment from mesquites. This phenomenon is not unique to the Santa Rita Experimental Range. This is world over desert systems and semi-arid systems encroaching in rangeland systems, grassland systems. Santa Rita happens to be a part of that, which is again trying to focus on this global perspective of what those drivers of change are. So the work that we do here on the Santa Rita doesn't just stay here on the Santa Rita. Ideally, it has implications globally, same as we can glean information from partners the world over and apply that here. So this graph then highlights the increase in canopy cover measured on the Santa Rita Experimental Range beginning a little before 1960 up here until about 2007, I believe. And we can see that it peaked right about 1995 and then a slow decline and now a tapering off. So if we were to extend this out here to 2020, largely unchanged as far as the nature of the canopy cover. That's not due to our own intervention as humans. This is really just what we would call density dependent factors. That mesquite were a new enough phenomenon that they're growing. The most successful mesquites were then able to choke out those that were less successful. When I say it's not due to our own intervention, it's not for a lack of trying. So this period from really the 1930s, late 1920s, 1930s, up to about 1970s or so, was really defined by, yes, we're quantifying ecological interactions of livestock grazing, but also hyper-focused on, wow, there didn't used to be mesquite here, now there's mesquite everywhere. What do we do about this? And so millions of dollars and countless people hours were spent on the Santa Rita trying to understand those dynamics as well, focusing primarily on control. And control is a tricky word when we're talking about ecology because it doesn't work. We can't control the world around us. So again, trying to quantify those drivers of change is important to understand how we fit within that system. But if your end goal is control, it's probably a fruitless venture. But we sure try. And anyone who's been out there now can see how well that worked because we run an average canopy cover in most of these areas about 22 to 30%. So these mesquite keep coming back and keep coming back and keep coming back. And so it's not enough to just remove mesquite. It's again, what are those drivers that are enabling these mesquite to actually generate? So really heavy focus on woody species encroachment over this period as well. All right, so what does that mean for today? Santa Rita has transitioned, I would say, from a grazing centric facility, brush management centric facility to today what we would call a open air ecological laboratory. At the time I put this together, we're about 900 peer reviewed publications. I think we are coming up closer to 1,000. We host about 35 research projects annually across the range. Those are different than that array of all the orange and blue dots that we saw for long-term research. These are other researchers from other institutions or the University of Arizona actively doing projects. What I like to say is it will focus on soil science, atmospheric science, and all points in between. So it has expanded again from brush management and livestock to ecohydrology, soil science, eddy flux and covariance towers, looking at litter composition, different shifts in biomass, wildlife management. There's focus now on human recreation. How do we interface with the environment, and ultimately, again, how do we put all these species together? So that translates into about 10 to 12 new studies annually. I think our average is probably closer to 15 these days, so going up a little bit. And then on average, we have about 10 long-term studies, so studies that will last more than 5 years on this area. One of our critical partners, and I'll say this for both open access to data as well as a long-term data set, is what I'll say is a relatively new partnership with the National Ecological Observatory Network. This is an NSF and Battelle managed initiative that encompasses the entirety of the United States and outlying territories. So Alaska, Guam, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and all the different ecotypes represented within the United States of America. So it's not broken down by every single state. It's what are those ecotypes, and what are the dynamics within the systems. So this map here on the left shows the distributed plots and the long-term data plots, data collection plots for neon, focusing on avian ecology, small mammals, ticks, mosquitoes, a few related to eddy covariance and flux monitoring with the actual flux tower, air sheds, things of that nature being located on the north central end of the range, and that is represented here. And so this presents a really unique opportunity, not just on the Santa Rita, but again, nationally, to focus on what the value of these long-term data sets mean. So the initiative with NEON is not to conduct research. They collect the data to enable anybody anywhere on the planet to be able to use and access those data. So it is a enormous biorepository of well, it's not entirely biological, it's an enormous repository of data, both biologic, organic and inorganic, we'll say, that is all hosted online through a data portal that you can access here, as well as the formal biorepository, which for domain 14 is in Tempe at ASU. So a collaborative initiative there. Again, by request, you can reach out to Patel and say, I'm a sixth grade science teacher. I'm interested in these sorts of data. How do I access them? Can you help me? Or I focus on eddy covariance in semi-arid systems. I'd like to access your tower data for these different things. Or I'd like to add devices onto the tower that pair and couple with the devices that are already here. So again, it's really a platform to enable data, data collection and opportunities for data that have never been possible before. This tracks very, very well and has been a highly productive and collaborative partnership between NEON in Domain 14 here in the Desert Southwest and the Santa Rita Experimental Range. And I do want to thank Abe Karam, who is the regional director for Domain 14. I'm sure we'll hear more about this as well because the other substation for Domain 14 is located on the Ornata station. And so there is a good pairing in. So think big data sets, long-term data, and again, what all of that means. Another critical piece for the present on the Santa Rita, and this is really a nice homage going back to where we started with livestock grazing, is the implementation of virtual fence. So anybody who's here today who drove in, take a look at the cattle that you see in the pasture on the way out. You'll see that they have a really nice black necklace on. Those are our new halter collars, and this is being led by Drs. Flavia Adwa and Aaron Lean as the PIs for this project, as a follow-up to our virtual fence project with a company called Vins that we're now operating on a different facility, VRV North. So the concept with this, you can kind of see down here, but it's similar to an invisible fence for a dog, where the collars will geo-reference based off of a radio network and not just track livestock locations, but they also provide a small auditory and electric stimulus where the cattle get used to it. And I've gone through it, it's kind of just like a light buzz, but it's not something you want to go through a lot. So the cattle get that beeping and like, no, I'm not gonna go that direction, I'm gonna turn around. So again, we've utilized and managed livestock with 4-strand barbed wire fences. We'll put out waters, we'll turn waters off, we'll put out minerals, and that's how you influence livestock behavior to date. This is a much more granular and technical way to go about, not just at the pasture level, but sub-pasture level. How can we rotate livestock? What does that mean for the distribution? How are they utilizing resources? Things of that nature. So by all accounts, halter has been incredibly effective in our small herd, and we are looking to expand. And then we'll look at some of the work done with Vince as well, or the other company we just moved to VRV. So this is just a really good high-level example of how the technology works or how it's rendered. So this is a heat map. And so the areas here in green are the highest density areas. These little red dots indicate the highest amount of use. The blue is a little bit lighter, and then these areas here are really going to be utilized. And this is a fixed period, June 13th through June 27th, so about 2 weeks back in 2022. We can also render the same as what we call a point cloud, exact same data displayed in a different way. And without getting into the details, without getting into the specifics, trying to model this, looking at different environmental or ecological variables, anybody anywhere on the planet can look at this and see that the distribution of livestock is selective. It's not random, right? So we get these hot spots. So here on these corners and right here, shockingly, that's a water. So livestock have to go back and forth to the water. Of course, there's going to be higher use there, but we also have these linear patterns displayed. Those are primarily desert washes, and some of them are roadway. So bearing in mind again that this is now the middle of June, hottest time of the year here in southern Arizona, we can then say, okay, well, what are the impacts of these washes at more granular level? So before we look at utilization and production monitoring in this pasture to end, say there's about this much biomass that can hold this many head of cattle for this long. Back to what David Griffiths was trying to do. What virtual fencing enables us to do, and being able to actually look at some of these geodynamics from the livestock, is this smaller scale. Are livestock congregating in these washes because that's where the majority of the biomass happens to be? There's these large bunch grasses, things of that nature. Is it that they're just easy corridors without brush to get back and forth to the waters? Or is it that that's where the largest trees are and it provides the most refuge during the summers? There's a lot of different dynamics in that, but again, we get a much finer scale overview of livestock resource selection and decision making as a result of these. So the next slide, I'll just show you in real time. One more click. I know it's a little hard to see, but you can see all these little dots bouncing around. So this is how the livestock move over that 2-week period out here in pasture 2N. So taking the same concepts and the same ideas that David Griffiths was tasked with over a century ago, asking the same questions, but being able to apply different technology to get a more granular scale, doing the same things with different lens, different focus. So another piece, going back to brush management for where we are today, and I'll spend a little bit of time on this, even though we are running close to the end, is our brush management initiative. This is a collaborative project with the Department of Forestry and Fire Management and Arizona Game and Fish Department, a variety of nonprofits as well. This map here, and I'll show a different rendering so we have a better sense of where we are in space. But this is the proposed treatment map between DFFM, represented in gray, different treatment blocks, and then the to be determined Arizona Game and Fish Department blocks as well for removal of mesquite. Now, I just spent a long time saying that it doesn't work. We tried it, it does not work. So there's some hubris in this and going back, right? But we're not looking to do this with a sense of control. We're gonna be the ones in charge. There's a lot of dynamics with this at play. And so we understand that mesquite is native. It is a primary driver of ecosystem function within these semi-arid ecosystems. If we go down and we account for that production monitoring that we use for livestock grazing, the majority of those native species, those native perennial grasses and most of the forbs that the cows rely on, associate very closely with those mesquites. When we get into that, I guess call it interstitial space between the mesquites, then we get hotter, more arid environments that's more conducive for things like Lehman's lovegrass that livestock will absolutely eat, but it doesn't generate that same level of biodiversity. So then the question is, well, why do you want to get rid of mesquite? And we're looking really at a balance in this. So from a watershed perspective, and I say this both identified independently and also with the FFM, Department of Fire Management, Forestry and Fire Management looked at this system in particular and said, if there's a fire on Santa Rita and there is winds blowing to the south, there's nothing to stop that fire from hitting the Santa Rita Mountains, Madera Canyon, significant loss to wildlife, habitat, significant destruction for watershed, economic drivers, things of that nature. So we want to be able to put in a bit of a buffer. So there's a practical management consideration in terms of what is the primary fuel load? Do we want heavy fuels like mesquite? Do we want fine fuels like desert grasses that are actually carrying those fires? If it's grasses, yes, it burns very fast, but we have more opportunity to get ahead there and put those out. So that's really one of the biggest drivers. The other driver in this is if you drive to other places, Fort Huachuca, San Rafael Valley, All-Flower Valley, near Bonita, there's a lot happening with removal of mesquite around the state. That's being done as well as a treatment for fuel reduction programs, but also as habitat management. And so we want to make habitat better for quail. We want to make habitat better for mule deer. There's going to be winners and losers in that, right? Because habitat for quail might not be conducive for some of these desert grassland species, avian species, for instance, small mammals. Whitetail might not prefer the reduction in canopy cover to mule deer. So there's trade-offs, but we look at these species, what are species in most need of these different habitat types, and then we can bet these treatments. The problem is there's not a lot of data to support the efficacy of those programs. Both the long-term efficacy of the removal programs, does it work? We tried it before and it didn't, so why are we going back to do it again? As well as what does this mean for rangeland recovery? Again, back 120 years with David Griffiths, how do these systems regenerate themselves after this type of disturbance? Next slide. So a slightly different overview. If you remember that OBO fan we were talking about here from Adair Canyon, this is the same representation on the breakdown of those treatment blocks. And then one more, same photo, broken down this way. So again, kind of like a catcher's mitt approach that will wrap around the base of the mountain and provide a buffer. But what we're trying to get at within these systems is looking at this variability again. So we have lower density mesquite areas here and more of a clay-based rocky soil type versus higher density, larger stands of mesquites here. So what's the efficacy of these different treatment types? And then again, how effective is it? If we go in, what's been proposed for the majority of these treatments is mechanical grubbing. The reason we're assuming that this might be more effective is that if you go in like we did for roughly a half century and we try to just cut a mesquite down, it's going to come back. And it comes back really, really angry. Before it might have been a big tree, now it's a really thorny shrub that's really hard to be able to manage. So then it's okay, we'll come in and we'll apply diesel on the stump after we cut it down. Turns out that's really effective. It's also really bad for the environment. So there's a reason that we don't do that. We've tried different types of defoliants, different herbicides that always seem to come back because the root, the biomass in the roots is so significant that it can store so much in the way of reserves that it can continue to regenerate. What grubbing means is that we'll literally come in with an excavator, grab onto the mesquite, pull it out by the roots. So any of you that are local, as you're driving by over the next few years, it's going to be kind of shocking because we're just going up and pulling these trees out, leaving them on the ground. But they can't come back if we do that. Most of them won't come back. So the question then is, okay, this is an inherent disturbance on the environment. What are we trying to accomplish? Is it effective? And what does this mean for these ecosystem dynamics? So as a result of all these different partnerships, we are working with researchers from the University of Arizona, ARS, different nonprofit groups, Tucson Bird Alliance, and notice the hat over here, and others to examine what does this mean for small mammals? What does this mean for dispersal potential population dynamics of these different species? Do mule deer actually recolonate these areas that are lower density, lower canopy cover? What is the selection process for different avian species? You know, both seasonally, so migratory species as well as resident species. What does that mean for those populations, namely for the actual perennial grasses, forbs on the rangeland? How do these systems manage? Because if we get rid of these mesquites, does that mean to get a layman's love grass monoculture? Or did we actually do a good thing by removing the one thing that seems to anchor the majority of the biodiversity on the Santa Rita Experimental Range? That leads into the next question then, well, what do we do about it, right? We know that there's going to be a subcomponent where we're reducing the potential of these systems to generate the biodiversity we'd seen before. So we're trying to get ahead of that. A bit of a spinoff here from the Santa Rita, by utilizing our Red Rock facility off of I-10 north of Tucson, cultivating what is now, according to Sarah, the largest native seed production facility in the state of Arizona. We started this as a proof of concept. I'd say we're still pretty much there, but we're generating a lot of interest, overlap with Institute for Applied Ecology, Plant Materials Center, and USDA. Borderlands Restoration Network, I'm trying to engage with them as well, utilizing this as a resource, especially for Santa Rita, generation of seed for these native perennial grasses that we can go back and actively reseed as a restoration campaign, utilizing that biomass. So we're going to have trees spread all over that are masticated or cut into pieces as a result of being grubbed in the rain. How do we reincorporate that biomass back into the system as a carbon sink and also a way to generate these grassland species? So trying to, again, get out ahead of generating a layman's love grass monoculture. So complicated system, but working with a great array of researchers to be able to deliver on all those outcomes and then say, hey, everybody, we tried this here. These things work really well. These things don't. Practically speaking, I mean, that's your tax dollars at work. So we do want to make sure that those are being used effectively. So that's more that land grant mission of how does this translate? You know, what does this mean for me? But then ecologically, we want to see that we live in vibrant, thriving systems. This is a way to help work towards that. All right. So, what does this mean for the future? Right now, and this isn't news to anybody, we're really in the midst of what we call a technological revolution. So data drives decision making. Data should drive decision making, right? There are things that are not data driven that are really, really important, but for purposes of science, data is the foundation. Science leads to revelations, it leads to discovery that ultimately does help us to learn about the world around us and make life better for ourselves and all living things on this planet. So the question is, how do we capitalize on these data? 120 years of continuous data collection on the same Rita Experimental Range, same from Coronado, same from Snow Station. Again, what does that mean for the past? What are those drivers of change? How do we better understand what those mechanisms are? What does that mean for today? And then how do we capitalize on that for the future? So, this question, slide. One of the things I'm very excited about, anybody who has a QR code, you can click on this and we'll get into the data portal in a minute. But we've just launched not just launched, about 18 months in now, what's called a lower WAN network. This is a long range wide area network. So some of you might be familiar with the term Internet of Things. It's been represented primarily for our houses. You open up your refrigerator and it tells you you're out of milk, for instance, those sorts of things. I don't need my refrigerator to tell me I'm out of milk, but it's the same kind of concept. So the thought is with this on our network now, we can deploy sensors on this radio network and it is cheap and by all accounts it is effective. This is the same technology that our virtual fence partners use. So rather than linking to satellite, which is inherently expensive, we can tie different devices onto our radio network. That goes back directly onto a U of A managed Wi-Fi network and data platform. So think again, we've been collecting long-term data for precipitation, vegetation transects, soil dynamics, things of that nature. Now we can do things like soundscapes, have visual components, so we can digitize repeat photography in a way we haven't done before. Things like soil moisture probes that are actually paired with our rain gauges across the range, different weather stations to enable a level of predictive modeling. So rather than us going out and saying, okay, there's this much biomass on the ground in a pasture that's this size, therefore this pasture can accommodate X number of cattle. We can now look at it on that granular scale and say, based off of the soil moisture probes paired with our remote sensing analyses of the range, we know that these areas have higher biomass than these areas, not pasture to pasture, but region to region, subset within those pastures, and then be able to utilize a network like virtual fencing to take advantage of those sorts of things. So much more granular approach to doing the same thing we've been doing for over a century, but capitalizing on technology to be able to do that. So I mentioned image analysis. One of the things we are very interested in is how do we actually generate these photos, which are very impactful and very moving, but how do we turn those into data and what do we do with them, right? So we say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. We can go on and all publicly available again. Think that data portal that's available. I just showed you. Anybody anywhere in the world can access all these data from the center at any point. You can see thousands of these photos represented on there, but after 10 or 15 photos, it's like, it's really cool, but also I get it, you know, from a public side. From a data-driven side, though, it's okay, well, we're looking at this particular prickly pear year after year after year after granular, right? But that's still a visual analysis. Now we're looking at feeding these data sets through a machine learning program that can look at individual pixels, pair those with precipitation data, pair that with temperature data, and look at these fluctuations in temperature cycles. For instance, in things like burrowweed, canopy cover, mesquite, these boom and bust cycles, things of that nature. So really leveraging a lot of these technologies to then use for that predictive modeling again for the future. So this is graph that doesn't mean anything other than it's an reflection of where we have been and ultimately how we capitalize on these data products like machine learning, AI, Internet of Things to continue to grow at more of an exponential rate for our capacity. None of this would matter, frankly, if we didn't engage the community and we did not engage students. So the whole reason I started with the experimental range and the experiment station generally is because it is a platform to be able to deliver these outcomes back to the community and students most especially. So one thing we're very proud of is the way we've been able to actually grow and interface with students because demographics are changing, access to the outdoors is changing, it's more and more difficult. A lot of these programs in the natural sciences took for granted the fact that, okay, well, all these students coming in, they're interested in natural resources because they grew up outdoors. So the foundational principles of how do you drive a four-wheel drive truck? I've never gone camping by myself, those sorts of things. We can use these facilities now to say, great, the curriculum and our programs are terrific, but students don't, it's harder and harder to give students access to these sorts of experiences. So how do we work with our various clubs here, Tierra Seca, Eco Restoration Club, Wildlife Society, to get kids outside? And this isn't just college students, this is K through 12. We've had folks all the way up to, I think, 98 years old up here. Also get the community outside, get them interactive, learn about the world around them, but also be able to deliver on both the data products and real world experiences. So just one more side thing I think is really important about the Santa Rita. So I will leave you with this then. It is a quote by Aldo Leopold from Sand County Almanac. And it says, a science of land health needs, first of all, a base datum of normality or a picture of how a healthy land maintains itself as an organism. I like this quote in large part because I really like Aldo Leopold, but it's also not right. But it's right and it's not right. So what Leopold is getting at is how do we return to a steady state? We need these large reservations like the Santa Rita Experimental Range, like Overnight, like Sonora Station, and these deep time data sets, be able to understand what those drivers of those ecosystems are. But the problem is, and where I would depart from this quote, is that there is no going back to a steady state. We're not going back to the 1890s, the early 1900s, where this was a vibrant grassland. The world is different. So it's not about trying to use that base datum of normality to get back to how it maintains as an ecosystem. It's what is that base datum of normality, but what does that mean as that snapshot in time? Because that base datum today is different than it was 100 years ago. So think again, rather than trying to go back to where we were, what are the drivers of this change? If there's one thing I can harp on the most, it is what are those ecological drivers? What are the anthropogenic drivers, human influence within the system? What really matters within them? And what, if we are looking towards some means of control or intervention, where is it worth our time to actually invest? Is a mesquite treatment, for instance, worth the investment? Does it make the environment more healthy? Does it prevent wildfire? Things of that nature. And then ultimately, you might be thousands of miles away from the Santa Rita Experimental Range. Why is the Santa Rita Experimental Range still relevant for somebody like you? We can't do that. We can't generate those outcomes without these long-term ecological data sets. So the future is very, very bright, not just, again, capitalizing on what we already know. How do we leverage these technologies to pair these data sets with our partners to then be able to do predictive analysis, figure out where we're going, try to make the world a better place. So, and these networks are a great driver for that. Next slide. That is the wrap up. So I do encourage all of you to attend if you are able. The remainder of our sessions, the last Friday of every month between now and April. Quick caveat here, everybody is more than welcome in February. The guest presenter will be online. It is Brendan Bestelmeyer of the Tornado. So if you want to come up, bird, have breakfast, lunch, hang out, we're just going to live stream the event here. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions. Doug Cullison is hoping to be able to join us in person from Texas A&M, and then we'll have a panel discussion with some of the details to emerge for April, tying all this back to IYRP. So again, access to the website. We have a couple minutes for questions, so before.
I was just over at Buenos Aires a few days ago. They have acres and acres and acres of sawn up mesquite. Does that mean that that's all that's gonna come back?
Not necessarily. So the question was on the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge here in southern Arizona, there's acres and acres and acres of mesquite that have been sawed down. So this is one of the pieces we're talking about. So they are using a method where it's called a cut stump treatment. So they'll cut the mesquite down and then apply an herbicide directly to the stump, designed not as a foliar herbicide that goes to the leaves, but it goes into the roots and ideally prohibits those roots then from generating new growth. It's more effective than methods of the past, but it's not 100% effective. And so they're examining the same as we are, what works and what doesn't. So we do work very closely with folks in the Altar Valley. So the hope is, they're hoping that no, those mesquites don't come back. But that's part of the data-driven component with that is, it is a stump-based herbicide that I think most of the data to date shows about 50 to 75% effectiveness in inhibiting regeneration. Go
Are
on.
there areas of the range that have never had cattle, they've been excluded from 1902 on?
There are. So the question is, are there areas of the centered experimental range that have had livestock excluded from 1902? They're not significant in size. I say significant. Some are verging on about 18 acres, I think, being the largest for some of these exposures that have been maintained. So, no square miles worth of country, but we do have a network of over 100 grazing exposures up to about 18 acres and then down from there into the meter range that have not had any form of grazing on their livestock.
Are different?
They do. In some cases they do, in some cases they don't. In pasture one, I think it was really one of the most compelling, and I don't have a map to show you, but this is kind of near the Santa Rita Ranch headquarters. There's an area in some of the higher country there that until the sawmill fire in 2017, it was mostly a layman's monoculture on the outside of the fence, and the areas that hadn't been grazed did have a much higher biodiversity. So multiple species of perennial bunch grasses, forbs, and things of that nature. Following the fire, that diversity went down, but you can still see a visual difference between inside the fence and outside the fence. There's a couple drivers for that, so it's not necessarily due to livestock grazing specifically. But it is a subcomponent of that as well. So it is interesting to get that visual.
One last question.
Yeah.
Do you have a picture of a rubber?
I should have put it in, and maybe that's a good question. So the question was, we have a picture of a grubber. So that might be a really good one to tie in for our fourth presentation here. We do have some videos, but I mean, in the end of the day, it's exactly what you imagine. It's an excavator on tracks with big claws, and it literally just grabs onto the base and pulls out as much as possible and can scoop it out and then sets it aside.
The roots go down like 40, 50, or 80 feet.
They do, yeah. 30 is getting pretty long, but they can go in some cases up to 60. And so the thought is really to break the root collar below the surface. So you're not going to pull up all 30 feet, but you do want to break that root collar just subsurface and make sure that there's nothing to be able to regrow.
I'd like to see one.
Yeah, well, if you come out here starting in February, you'll get any questions online?
No
Okay.
questions online.
You were talking about in the areas where you're trying to control the fire and you're removing the mosquitoes, grabbing them out. You're leaving them lay there. Does
Correct.
that not contribute to the fire?
So that's one of the things that we're looking at. Allegedly, no. The question is, all right, if we're pulling mosquitoes out by the roots and we're just leaving them on the landscape. So we'll again, the process of pulling them out is called grubbing. From there, the process is called mastication, where we don't just leave the mosquitoes, we'll buck them up in small pieces. And then it's called lop and scatter, where you take them and you distribute them. I asked the same question initially and said, well, isn't that just increasing the fuel? Yeah, you got something that was green and alive and now it's dead. The answer is yes, it absolutely does. It increases the fuel load in the system, but it's really the nature of that fuel load. And so the science behind that is that you're still using fine fuels in these grasses as the primary driver. And so that is a high speed, low energy fire. So it might be moving very, very fast. And yes, it has the energy to ignite these heavier fuels as the woody species. But what it does is it slows those grass fires down and it sucks the energy out of the fire because there's more energy going to ignite that woody biomass on the ground than there would be to carry the fire forward. So it's not that the fire is not going to spread, but essentially by the time that woody biomass were to ignite, the fire's already moved on anyways, it just slows it down. So that's the thinking. Makes it a little tricky to walk out there in some of these treatment areas, but it also does provide that opportunity again to then go in and reseed and work on some of this regeneration and restoration practices as well. So very good question. Go ahead.
In line with that, has anybody done the math to figure out if it would be worthwhile to sell the mesquite chips or smoking? I mean, you take a tree, you cut down all the brush and just throw that through a chipper and spread it all over the place, but then the bulk of the mass of the tree make larger chips bag it and sell it as biscuit chips.
Yeah, so the question with that is, does it make economic sense to sell the mesquite after it's been chipped as smoking chips, for instance? Or something you can use for, a mesquite smoke, mesquite charred steak, if you want to put it that way. All I can say, it's not anecdotal. Short answer is, we're probably not gonna do that in particular. But we are working with Department of Biosystems Engineering to try and figure out, is there an application for all this biomass? Because there's gonna be a lot. So, what can we do with it? Where I was going with this though is, my wife and I had stayed in Sassabee, at the La Osa Ranch a couple of years ago. And looking at truckloads, pickup bed fulls of mesquite coming from northern Sonora. Where is everybody going with this? Turns out they're going to Los Angeles for boutique restaurants, providing the grain source mesquite at $2,000 a truckload. So that thought's resonated. Bankroll the whole operation. But what we have asked instead, a lot of it is going to be chips. So we'll be chips. So you can come pick some up if you want to take it home. But otherwise, that's more biomass under the soil. That also aids with some of these reseeding initiatives and things that we would do. So we can have these contrasts again of, well, we chipped it here, but we didn't chip it here. Apply the same restoration practices. What are these net outcomes? So just one more layer of that data collection potential on that. The other element with the mastication, I mentioned some of the watershed components. We have also asked Department of Forestry and Fire Management, which should be a win-win, is when you're cutting these large mesquites, rather than cutting them into sections like this as ready-made firewood, can you leave them in 4, 6, 8-foot sections that we can use to distribute across the soil surface to slow down surface water, surface flow, actively reseed behind it. So Elise Gornish is our eco restoration specialist with Cooperative Extension. She's done a lot of work with Media Lunas, similar types and approaches where you can see behind these structures. It generates what's the word I'm looking for? Nutrient composition behind these structures that then facilitate new growth of the species. Those are areas where we can reseed. We can also put the biomass in washes for these head cuts and channels and things, and reduce channeling and ideally encourage additional infiltration as well. So there's a lot that we're planning to do with it. Habitat piles for quail and other species as well, small mammals. So building those up into different piles, different structures, different compositions and densities, seeing what the critters like. There's a lot of Eagle Scouts that are interested in contributing to those projects. So we will be using it to the extent that we can, but we won't be able to use all. Go ahead.
You mentioned precipitation measurements over the range. Is there any plan for having some of those automated and getting into the system and therefore going off to other databases like Cocoa Rise?
Yeah, so the question is with our precipitation gauges, we have 21 across the range. At this point, I'm going out and collecting those. It's an interesting system. It's basically a large can, and we're converting pounds of rainfall into inches of rainfall or millimeters of rainfall. And so there's a whole conversion system, but basically we charge the can with a little bit of water, an oil barrier and antifreeze to keep the cans from expanding. We go out and weigh those first of every single month. So we'll be doing that this weekend. That's how we translate that data. So to the question, can we automate the process? I would love to. I enjoy being out on the range, but that is one of the first things we're trying to do with this lower land radio network. So we do have a couple real-time precipitation gauges paired specifically with our older system to be able to ensure that they're calibrated correctly, that what we're receiving in our analog system, if you want to put it that way, pairs with the digital. Assuming that that works and it's worth the investment, then yes, we will incorporate those digital arrays, maintaining them paired with the original array for at least the foreseeable future. But the benefit is, rather than having data once a month, now we get once every 15 minutes. So much higher level of granularity. So thinking again, what does this mean for predictive modeling? Now we can look for monsoons. Yes, it rained on this end of the range. No, it didn't rain on this end of this. Didn't rain on this end of the range. And then pair those with some of these other networks again for real-time access anybody needs. So that is a big push for this year to try and build out that network.
Cool.
Go ahead.
Talk about reseeding some of this. What kind of preparation for soil or the soil preparation will be done for that, or what? How will you even do the reseeding? talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the question is, what are the methods or the preparations that will be needed for these reseeding projects? And the answer is it's a lot. So, because we are an experimental rangeland, we are trying multiple different things again to see what's most effective. So there's been a big push with creation of seed balls. Again, Elise Gornish is really a pioneer, for creation and implementation of seed balls. My wife has also been working with Friends in Dare Canyon and a local grant with Freeport McMoran, to engage the community hands-on in some of these projects to generate seed balls for these native species. What that means is that we'll put hundreds to maybe a few thousand seeds in a clay pellet, with compost. And then those can get generated out there on the landscape, because if you just put seeds out, they're gonna be eaten by ants, birds, small mammals, blow away and fry in the sunshine, and it's not very effective. So think again, we can take one of those big 8-foot sections of mesquite, lay it there on the soil surface, downslope from the water, and add seed balls behind it and just wait for it to rain. When the rain comes, breaks down the seed balls that have a very nutrient base and they're ready to grow. That will be one of the methods we're looking at. We will just do broadcast seeding. And we'll look at that. How does broadcast seeding compare with areas that have been mulched, areas that haven't been mulched? Do we rake it in? Do we need to target it around masticated mesquites? Are we going to put it behind rock structures, things of that nature as well? So there'll be a variety of methods, again, just trying to see if we broadcast seed, we know that it's not so effective. So how do we refine the systems to ensure that we're minimizing waste and maximizing productivity? Any other questions? All right, well, I really appreciated everybody knowing. Everybody here is welcome to stay as long as they like, enjoy birds, enjoy the creek, have some lunch. I very rudely have to jump onto another meeting, unfortunately, but I'll be here for a bit. So hopefully I catch you after that. And otherwise, we look forward to seeing everyone in February. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.